War. Julian Assange, you can see why he's banged up in Belmarsh, because what he's doing is spitting facts and providing evidence. Today we've been talking about war a lot because it's the anniversary of the Iraq War. Happy anniversary, Iraq War. How do you do it? And it's 1 year now of the ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russia, all the terrible deaths incurred, particularly, Ukraine, who are obviously under attack. And there is an ongoing war in Syria. We're talking to Dave Smith today on the subject of war. Dave, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm a huge fan.
Oh, that's so kind of you to say. Dave, what do you think about Julian Assange's maxim there and how applicable it continues to be, even in conflicts like this current one?
Well, I mean, it's not really debatable that he's correct. I mean, factually, that's what happens. I mean, so many special interests have been enriched over the last just 20 years of, say, the war on terrorism. Every one of those bills to arm Ukraine ends up just being cash in the pockets of weapons manufacturers or the CIA budget increasing. I don't know. It's like with the COVID stuff. I don't know if that's the only motivating factor. I think sometimes they also wanted, they might also want to, say, tank Donald Trump's chances of getting reelected, but their pharmaceutical companies are also raking in profits. I think they did want to overthrow Saddam Hussein for other reasons, but that's definitely part of it.
Dave, with the ICC announcing that it's their bizarre intention to arrest Vladimir Putin, a man who I don't imagine would cooperate with an ordinary arrest, although having seen him attempt to shake hands, I can see that if you were to approach him from the front, he could be vulnerable. What do you feel about the Syrian war, the war in Syria and the bombing of Yemen, which indicts like Biden, Trump and Obama all as war criminals to the same standard of Putin? By the same standard by which Putin is being charged?
I mean, I think it far exceeds it if we're just being objective. I mean, Ukraine is a catastrophe, and Putin has a lot of responsibility for that. So he doesn't have all the responsibility, but the humanitarian crisis in Yemen is objectively, if that's a catastrophe, this is a catastrophe times 10. There's just way more people dying, and it wasn't soldiers dying over the last 8 years in Yemen. It was like babies starving to death and dying of cholera and stuff. So yeah, look, there's a great video, I don't know if you've ever seen, where Noam Chomsky just breaks down the war crimes of every post-World War II president of the United States of America. So I'm fine if we want to indict war criminals, but let's get them all, And you see something like, if you look at Yemen particularly, you just see how much, like the whole military industrial complex, American empire establishment, they care about humanitarian issues when it's convenient. You don't see every day in the corporate press people talking about the humanitarian crisis in Yemen or in Palestine or in Syria or in Somalia. But we do see the one on Russia's border that we can blame on Russia. That's the one that they hyper-focus on.
Yeah, that does concern me. And even when we raise these points, we are often smeared. And it's difficult not to assume, even though it seems reductive even when I'm saying it, that the financial benefits of these conflicts are the determining factor. And the alliances between the military-industrial complex and the media and the government are what determine the way these stories are presented. Because you're right, if that were not the case, you would hear as much about Yemen, you would hear as much about other conflicts. If the metric by which we measured catastrophe was deaths and destruction, and nobody is saying that those things are not present in the tragedy in Ukraine and that it oughtn't be stopped as quickly as possible, but other criminals would be brought to the forefront as well. In our recent show, we talked about the lack of moral authority for any agency that would seek to arrest Trump. That's not saying that Trump isn't guilty of wrongdoing. In fact, we're ignoring that altogether, because if Trump is guilty, then the Clinton campaign would be guilty by the same measure. But what we're saying is that the lack of faith in institutions that we are currently experiencing means that we clearly need systemic change. Am I right in understanding, Dave, that that's precisely your personal perspective? And if you are a libertarian, I know you are, I'm just using this rhetorically, like, what is the role of government? How minimal can government involvement in the lives of ordinary Americans, ordinary people of all persuasions be? And do you not agree that the role of the government and the function of the government is supposed to be to, in a sense, provide some kind of edifice against corporate corruption, even if it obviously doesn't do that now. It does the bloody opposite. It'd just be good for you to unpack some of those ideas for us, please.
Yeah, sure. I mean, well, I think I'd like the government to be about as small as we could possibly get it. And I think from my perspective, the idea that the government was ever supposed to be a shield for the people against big corporate interests is always, there might be some people who really believed that. I think in reality, it has never been that, and it's always been, much more a tool for big money interests than anything that was ever working against them. And if you ever see, anytime that you ever saw the government working against big business, it was almost always on behalf of some other big business who wanted their competition stomped out. That's just the way of the world. It's like power corrupts, and there's nothing more powerful than a government. And so if you're saying that you need the government to check the power of a corporation, well, in order to do that, it's going to have to be more powerful than that corporation. And so now, once you have this power center, it's going to become a race to see who can buy it off, and who's going to have a better shot of doing that than the biggest businesses. So I think the whole paradigm, like you talked earlier about like the left-right paradigm being all kind of like it doesn't really apply anymore. I think that basically it's not a question of like, are you anti-big business or anti-big government? I think if you oppose one, you have to oppose the other because they're all in bed together. And, just to touch on what you said there about the kind of like getting called all the names because you oppose the war, on this anniversary of Iraq, just remember that the people who were opposed to this war, the war in Iraq, the line back then was you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. They basically said, if you don't want to overthrow Saddam Hussein, then you're happy that 9/11 happened. You're on their side of that. And that now, years later, even John McCain on his deathbed in his memoir wrote that he acknowledged the war was a mistake. Everyone now acknowledges that those people were right to oppose the war. So just to keep that in mind with all the people, they'll call you like a Putin apologist or something like that now if you oppose the West's involvement in the war in Ukraine. But yeah, it's all the whole thing is a racket, and it's all big business interests that control the governments.
That's really interesting that you say that, mate. That it plainly was a transgressive war. And the way, and I didn't remember that they said, that they equated it with terror, made it unpatriotic, and made it like you were dishonoring those that died on 9/11. And now, even if you're non-compliant around coronavirus, remember there was the same kind of shaming narrative that, like as if you were a friend of coronavirus, like you were his little mate carrying it about and stuff. Like, it's weird, the role that the palette that is drawn from, even though sometimes we think of these systems as sophisticated, secular, and of course by their nature political, the game they're playing is emotional. They're dealing with things like shame and fear and sort of destroying your personal ability to live life, So I can understand, I appreciate libertarianism from that perspective. I think a lot of attacks that I hear on libertarianism is that it's somehow disavowing communal responsibility and collective power. But I don't believe that those things should be imposed by some centralized agency anyway. I think they should be voluntary. I am a libertarian in so much as I do not like being told what to do. And when someone tells me what to do, I think, where are you getting that authority from? And when it's like, we're the government or we're the police, I think, well, I don't agree with either of those things. So spiritually, I agree with it. But how do you square it with the idea that we're here to take care of and love one another?
Yeah, so from my perspective, it's like the complete opposite of that criticism of libertarianism. I think we're empowering the community. I mean, the idea that like libertarians aren't arguing that people shouldn't join groups and help each other and do things as a community. We're arguing that it should be done voluntarily, that it shouldn't be done through force, that you should, every inch of government is there with the threat of a gun to your head. It's like you pay your taxes or you go to jail. Like every law has a gun behind it saying you violate this and we will throw you in a cage. It's really insane when you think about it, in like how advanced modern human civilization is, and that we still will throw human beings in a cage like an animal for ridiculous crimes. And I mean, okay, if you murder someone or rape someone or stab someone or set someone's house on fire, okay, fine. Maybe that's the best we can do. You kind of think still we could find something better, but regardless of that, the idea of like funding this monopoly on violence at the threat of will ruin your life, and it's such a binary to say, oh, if we didn't do it that way, then there'd be no community. Then no one would care about taking care of the sick, or no one would think about like, oh, there's someone who's hard on their luck, we have to help them out. I just don't believe it. I don't believe that these people, these genocidal maniacs, these blood-soaked monsters, are like the only way we would make sure grandma had a sandwich, is if they're funded.
That's good. Because actually, that sort of misanthropic assumption is what underwrites centralized and legal authority anyway. The assumption that if you leave people alone, no, they're going to do. They're going to run into the streets and start masturbating and killing each other. That's like the idea that legitimizes the state power. I suppose early sovereign power was underwritten by the idea of protection. There are bandits, there are threats, there are dangers. If you give the king your taxes, the king will protect you from those threats. But it's mutated into something extraordinary, and it's pretty obvious that even the most unquestioned version of democracy is laughable in 2023, that you need a representative to go 400 miles or whatever on horseback to tell the central authority, this is what this parish believes. It's antiquated and it's irrelevant, and it's only being kept alive because it's beneficial to the kind of state and corporate interest that you rightly diagnose as being a kind of hybrid, a hydra, and as you said very eloquently, Dave, a blood-soaked monster. Dave, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. I hope we get to have many more like it. Dave Smith is an advocate for anti-war, and clearly, and an advocate for freedom, host of Part of the Problem podcast, which you can find wherever you find podcasts. Thanks again for joining us, Dave.
Thank you so much, man. Keep doing what you're doing. It's incredible.
Thank you, man. You too. We'll see you soon. Thank you very much.